you can have up there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Recording locally it is.
Okay, right. So this is the SIG CLI meeting for December 20 and the last one of 2017. And before we get started, actually, why don't we, I think we have one or two new attendants, at least Ellen and maybe someone else. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves?
Hello, I'm Brian Miles.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Ellen.
All right. I'm Ellen. I'm an intern with Altrici. So yeah.
All right. I'm Brian Miles. I work at Heftio, and I lead the Case On It project.
Hi, I'm Antoine, and I work with Phil.
Hi, I'm Sean Sullivan, and I also work with Phil.
Awesome. Welcome, guys. I know some of you were already here for some time, but anyways, welcome. And I really feel good to be well covered while I'm out. Okay, so going to the topics we have first, kubectl package management. Who's that?
So there is some discussion about how are we going to manage the package for kubectl. We can either move it or fork it. So there's a document. I wrote a document about that. So I want to have a consensus here so we can proceed either way. Let me find the doc.
Menchi, what's that about specifically? Is it, meaning what's the package manager we are going to use to the kubectl repo or something like that? You mean other than Go deps, depper, or is it another subject?
Part of it, it's like that. So the I think this more accurately the scope is for the package that we want to keep using in the new in the kubectl repo. How are we going to manage them? We can either move them to the new repo and then revender back, and or we can fork them so it won't and evolve with the new fork in the kubectl repo without jeopardize the stability of the kubectl binary in the core repo.
So if I understand it right, you're talking about the package directory inside of Kubernetes and the packages that relate to kubectl. Do we bring those over to the new repo, or do we vendor them in from Kubernetes itself? Is that it?
Yes, kind of that. I shared the doc in the chat.
Could you add a link to the doc in the notes?
Oh, sure.
So I have a question here about this. I see there are new tools such as Conflate, and those are in the kubectl repo. As I understand it, these are kind of experiments. Is the intent of this to say they are going to now be part of kubectl because we're bringing the experiments into kubectl itself? Or are those going to be handled separately?
I think that's a separate question from this proposal. Is that your intention, Matt?
Yes, and I just noticed in the proposal it notes conflate specifically, which is why I brought it up, because it kind of touches on it. They may. I'm just curious whether it's a separate thing from kube control, but they'll have shared packages, or if the intent is to bring, if conflate is part of this and the restructuring, and it is tangential, so we can get to it elsewhere.
Yeah, I think
Que os anos foi passando, ela não evoluiu.
Hey, sorry, Diego,
Só tem
can
100
you
na
go on
sala.
mute?
Ups, fala com ele?
I muted him for you. Yeah, since that is, I think that's probably a more involved question. Maybe we should handle it in its own discussion separately. But initially, no part of this has conflate as being assumed to be part of kube control. However, we do need to. I think it's an example of a place where we were trying to build something and had dependencies on packages in the Kubernetes that were not available.
So I do have some experience over the past 3 years trying to vendor Kubernetes myself, staying up to date, and I would strongly recommend that you try to avoid vendoring Kubernetes at nearly any cost.
Yeah, we agree with that.
So
Yeah.
I can add to that. On Helm, they tried to use external packages such as client Go and whatnot, and they found it to be difficult. So they ended up pulling in Kubernetes, copying packages out, and to really work with it well, especially against something like head, with the amount you have to deal with, it can be difficult. Either you have this massive vendor directory, or you end up with trying to pull them in at build time, which slows down your CI, and Kubernetes is quite large, which means it has a big impact there.
I agree with both those things. Both solutions are bad. But yeah, actually, I think that's part of why in other proposals, and maybe this one, I've been starting to lean towards just write it in the kube control directory, like write what we need there. And instead of spending months trying to get a package moved from one place to another to clip certain dependencies, if we only need 10% of what it does 90% of the time, just write a simplified version. Do the simpler thing.
So the proposal is to copy over the packages and just do maintenance on what's in Kubernetes, and in the kube control directory to iterate more rapidly on the future of it there. Is that right?
Yes.
So, I think there's other options here that we can explore. I think one of them is the API machinery folks have been driving things with staging and being able to pull things out there, so we could create new packages through staging.
No, please, no. No, Joe.
It sucks, don't get me wrong. I mean,
Yeah,
the other option is that if we are going to create duplicates, we can create duplicates in new repos versus creating and then we solve the problem for other folks moving forward, right? Because like if we look to actually say pull kubeadmin out, also it's going to actually share some of the same issues in terms of these things, and I'd hate to actually see all copy paste code across like n different repos as we pull n different things out.
Kubeadmin can vendor kube control.
But okay, come on. Like at some point, like we should split kube control up then into essentially like.
Yes, at some point it should be split.
Yeah, keep doing.
Repo.
It feels like, oh, we've moved from vendoring Kubernetes to vendoring kube control just so that I can get a bunch of util libraries. Right? That's weird that like kube control then becomes our util bucket.
Why?
Hold on. What util libraries are we talking about?
Yeah, I think that would be
an example.
Yeah, there's a list, a couple lists floating around, but it varies in range from stuff like CLI focused things such as printing objects or traversing directory structures recursively and walking them and parsing configs. into a structure, the probably would contain stuff like auto update libraries for updating binaries, test infrastructure potentially, which is actually going to live in a separate repo.
So, okay, can I ask some questions? Because digging into this, I'm a little bit new, and I'm going to expect some other people here are a little bit new too. When it comes to auto updating binaries, do we have that functionality today?
No.
Are we going to plan on using, say, one of the popular packages that lets you do that already, or are we thinking we'd write our own?
We need to decide. There's a number of variables there because we're also talking, there's folks who want to write plugin discovery and installation. And so there'd be overlap with the plugin installation and discovery with auto update, such as like checking, like finding the binaries, checking their signatures, installing them, all that sort of stuff. So I think my preference would be not to write things we don't need to write. But I also don't want to write, if we are going to have, need to write our own installer for plugins, for instance, I'd rather have us just use one interface for that.
Okay.
So I don't have an answer. I think the answer is we need to look into what the simplest thing is.
Okay. I also want to make a comment on the API machinery related stuff. Actually taking the staging repo and syncing it out and then being able to use newer stuff, it turns out that for consumers of that, it's problematic. There are a lot of complaints from people who have to consume that setup. And so that's the reason you'll generally find that I'm not a proponent of it. It's just the active case of people who have to use this regularly or consume new versions, like take Client Go. There are so many complaints every time a new version of Kubernetes comes out because of people who are heavy Client Go users having to rewrite hundreds of lines in their application because the API changed within Client Go or the packages it uses, and that takes a significant amount of time. And so there's a lot of known issues there that if we could avoid staging, it's not ideal.
That issue doesn't seem to be related to staging. That issue seems to be related to inside of Client Go. Now, I will admit that it is painful. Technically, it does follow semantic versioning, but we've never had a semantic version of Client Go last more than 3 months. I think that's the crux of the problem that you're hitting here, not so much the fact that it gets pushed out of staging.
No, there's the syncing problem. Is syncing fixed so the tip of master is always synced and then occasionally tagged?
As of a week and a half ago, we managed to pull that infrastructure outside of Google. Red Hat's hosting that infrastructure now, and so Stefan has direct access, and so does Chow. So now both of them can have direct access to the bot to keep it up to date, keep it working. And since we, OpenShift, are also heavy users of Client Go, we care when it doesn't sync. So I would expect that to become more stable over time.
Okay. Yeah, and part of the issue with staging, which you point out here, isn't the syncing. It's actually the heavy refactoring inside of Kubernetes that causes the packages to be heavily refactored all the time. And that's the bigger issue that impacts anybody consuming it downstream. And I don't know if there's a nice way to make that easy.
Well, the other thing with staging is that it's still building inside the core repo. Like, we're trying to move away from building more and more stuff inside the core repo because it has 3-month iteration cycles and all the reasons that have been listed in the past. And so by building it as part of staging, we're still doing that. We haven't gone out of that track.
So, okay, so another thing to recognize is that this stuff is relatively stable compared to a lot of the refactoring that's going on with Client Go. One option here is that we could take these utilities, pull them out into separate repos, vendor them back in, and then when you update those things, you're going to have to re-vendor it. That is painful. Nobody's going to disagree with that. But what it means is that we're going to actually think very carefully about changing and updating these dependencies, and you'll have to make sure that they can vendor back in. As we move to something like DEP, it may make more sense to actually resolve these things to the latest version and do more integrated tests across that stuff. But like as of the problem with staging is that it allows and almost encourages tightly coupled refactoring. right? And if we vendor it out, then you have to think about refactoring in a way that's backward compatible.
So, Joe, I got to say, I have experience doing that the other way around too. If you look at OpenShift API and OpenShift Client Go, those are separate libraries that then get vendored into OpenShift Origin. The task of actually maintaining, syncing, opening the pulls that keep everything consistent, and then being able to do the series of pulls in order is very non-trivial. I think that OpenShift is able to manage it largely because we have extremely tight control over what goes into those repos. Because right now it's just API and Client Go. I don't think that I would see something like API Machinery and the Kates.io API and the Kates.io Client Go as being able to maintain a reasonable cadence and still be able to stay coherent.
So Dave, just to be clear, I'm not suggesting this for Client Go. I think like we got to recognize that there are parts of the system that are still under heavy refactors pressure, like Client Go. There's other parts of the system which we just want to share, and honestly, they don't change that much. And what is the right way to actually share those? And right now, the discussion has gone towards forking, which I think is probably going to do us a long-term disservice.
Can I make maybe a practical suggestion here? We start by initially just forking for kube control. And then along the way, the first time we identify something that should be good use shared code, we break it out into a common library package. And we fix it up, make sure it's got proper tests and it stands on its own and it stands within its own right. And then once that's ready, we can bring it back into kube control, and if it makes sense, we can vendor that also back into Kubernetes itself and remove the outside code, because now it's a true dependency.
So,
and then we can start to add more to that over time.
We also have experience taking a piece that used to be integrated and moving that piece out in sort of a cloned repo, pull it out with a minimal set, re-vendor what we need to, and rebuild it for separate development. When you try to pay down the debt on that, it's non-trivial. It's not that it shouldn't be done, it's that the work should not be underestimated. And that what happens during that intermediate stage is you effectively freeze your repo. Your repo is stuck because you're stuck on old levels of vendor dependencies that you can't get rid of, and you can't move forward and you can't move backward. So you end up having to snip your links anyway, and you do it under time pressure. One thing that I would be interested in looking at is if I look at kube control and I see three logical units, right? I see one set of truly generic functionality, and these are things that use runtime unstructured from last year when we built, I guess Phil built it, I think. Runtime unstructured, no switch to it, that's your basic CRUD. I see another bucket that is dealing with polymorphic things. So we have scale as a good citizen example. Scale client, and it can scale any scale thing, and we're in the process of switching over to it. I would also put into this bucket things where you're looking for a pod specy thing. You can model that in a couple different ways, but at its core, that's a polymorphic style command. And then the last thing I see are bespoke commands that have heavy semantic knowledge of what it is they modify. And things I put into that right now today would be something like rollout. It would be something like reconcile. And I would be looking at either snipping those and saying, you know what, that's a separate tool, you can plug it in, or trying to change the problem into something where you have a generic resource that you can hit, or maybe both. But I would look at it and say that those are our buckets, and I think that any tool that gets developed will eventually have those buckets. Now, I do apologize. I have not been coming to this meeting regularly. Have we done something similar, identified buckets like that? And
yeah, we've had those discussions. I think there's even a couple more. I mean, we've also talked about just generic CLI infrastructure that doesn't depend on Client Go. or API machinery or any of that stuff. And maybe another way, I think, similar to how you've talked about it, I kind of think of it as stuff that, like, just purely CLI, stuff that depends on client. Then there's stuff that depends on client Go or API machinery or that sort of stuff, but does it in a completely generic way, maybe looking at discovery service or open API schema information to make decisions about things. Then there's stuff that depends on specific APIs. And then maybe a fourth bucket of stuff that doesn't just depend on specific APIs, but has a bunch of bespoke logic for those APIs built in. But yeah, similar.
Yeah, and so I look at those categories, and I say that if I were trying to split it apart, right? If I were going to take what I have today and try to split it into those buckets, what would I do to split it into those buckets? I would actually try to attempt that split. I would do things like identify my links and start cutting them, similar to how we did with API machinery and API server and client Go and metrics in the past, right? The past year was about that, and it is possible to identify and mutate those. And once you have the links snipped, then you get a lot of freedom about what it is you want to do. Do you want a separate repo? It's a thing you could do. If you're a Leaf node, if nobody vendors you back in, if K8s Kubernetes doesn't have a need to vendor you back in, then moving yourself out into your own repo, that's a thing that wouldn't be very painful. But it would allow a path from here to there.
Yeah, so I think like the question is, it might be helpful to focus on the goal, right? The goal is we want to be able to develop new commands in the kube control repo, or rather outside of the Kubernetes repo, right? Now, there are maybe two competing goals within that. One is we just want to build stuff in the kube control repo, period. Like we just want to be able to build stuff there, us as a SIG, right? And then the second goal that somewhat competes with that is we want to enable the ecosystem of folks like Helm or any other CLI to be able to take advantage of that same stuff. And what is like the simplest way to address that solution?
I guess I would say I would not start. I do not think that the simplest way to achieve that is going to involve copy and paste, and I don't think it's going to involve vendoring Kubernetes. I can see a couple different paths that are both valid for getting there. Right, the one path is an evolution of what we have from here to there, snip the links, and then move the pieces out, right? Move a core piece of functionality out, and what you're left with is you get rid of all the special stuff, things that have heavy knowledge of what it is they're modifying. That stuff doesn't end up living in kube control.
I don't think, yeah, thanks. I agree with what you're saying. I don't think we were ever considering moving any of that stuff out as part of this proposal. This proposal isn't about how to move like command A, foo, or bar out. This proposal is about how do I read a file into a config object, because the library to do that is in Kubernetes, and I want to do it in Kubernetes kube control. Which is totally
okay, Phil. So just a question. This does not extend, at least in this specific proposal, for actual commands, right?
Correct.
Because that's another issue we have, right? We have a lot of commands on our client, on kubectl specifically, that does has a lot of logic in it, right? Business logic. Take, for example, kubectl run. It does a lot of stuff, and if you want to do that in other clients like a web console or another kind of client, IDE plugin or anything like that, you will just have to replicate the entire logic It would be useful if that could be reused, but that's not a proposal on this specific proposal, right?
Correct.
So our experience with API machinery was that the discipline of moving packages one at a time, or however many you can at a time, into a staging repo, where you snip your links, you do the move, and then it's pinned. It's like a ratchet, and you can't ever move it back, and you can't add naughty dependencies. Will definitely help for something that you're looking at. It sounds like you want to move Resource Builder, right? I agree. Resource Builder would be a great thing to move, and we can talk about. If you had a spot in staging to drop it, you would be able to start turning the ratchet, and you would be able to move the resource builder. And you probably are going to want a consistent way to handle a kubeconfig file loading. I talk about whether you like that sort of file loading as it is, or if it would change, but you would end up being able to move that piecemeal as well. And as you find more of these utilities, you can move them out and ensure that their dependency trees don't regress.
We won't want to do it through staging, though. That is not going to work, because our goals are to iterate faster, have more releases, all that sort of stuff.
I guess staging as a required end state, but as an intermediate state, I think it would help you tremendously. I think you'd be able to perform the refactors that you need fairly quickly, right? We've done that in the past. Joe Beta complained about it bitterly, but I think in the end he was happy with where we landed.
But no one's ever actually successfully migrated out of staging, right?
No one has tried. So the pieces that we have in staging today are not leaf nodes. The pieces that we have in staging today are roots, right?
So I also think that our dependency management tools are not up to snuff here. Semantic versioning doesn't work well when you're doing active, refactoring type of things, because you essentially have to, if you're making a lot of interface changes, it's very difficult to manage that, because across these things with semantic versioning, because we'd be at semantic version number 387, right? If we were actually doing it that way.
Well, actually, I have one solution for that, if you don't mind.
Go for it, man.
I think there's a way to, and Antoine told me about this, by the way, so he can correct me. But my understanding is there's a way to cut branches and have branches tied to packages. So when you break semantic versions, or when you break your backwards compatibility, you can have the package renamed and keep the old package at the same time. So you don't have to.
Yeah, but you would
it still becomes a very complicated dance.
Yeah, you would have 3,000 version anyway.
Yeah, so you end up with lots and lots of renaming. Where this gets hard, especially for consumers, is the fact that we do keep breaking the API, and the fact that we just keep doing this, it makes it hard for people who want to consume it. And now we're talking about, well, we do this, and so how do we try to make it work well when we do this? But the problem is that we're doing it just makes it hard for downstream consumers. And it probably always will. And the way a lot of people solve this is they don't break their APIs very often. And so is there a way we can take some of these and move them into, we're not going to break the API all the time, and we can do it in a way where we do additive things rather than breaking the API? Because that's the typical case. That's why you don't see a whole lot of projects out there with semantic version 300 when they use that kind of versioning scheme, because they're able to not break their public API all the time.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a goal. I think that's orthogonal somewhat, but it's definitely something we should work towards.
But that's what we're trying to do with kubectl, isn't it? But if we move to staging, then we're so coupled to Kubernetes, and we lose the
Staging is a tool. You can use it in multiple ways. You could use staging where you still take semantic differences very, very seriously.
But it's not been done.
But it's extra work to do that. Whereas if you break it out into another repo and revender it, you can't avoid it. You can't avoid taking breaking changes seriously.
Yeah.
So I have one question. The initial thing you said, I agreed with, which was I'd like these libraries as we write them to be used by other commands. I also think that as written today, they were never meant to be consumed by external folks, which has a bunch of other factors that are important to consider, such as the interfaces are very complicated and relatively poorly documented, and assume that you have a firm understanding of like API machinery.
So I mean, I wouldn't be opposed, and I think this is one of the plans that Matt was talking about. I believe, I don't know, we've had a long ranging discussion here. I mean, I wouldn't be opposed to taking these things, renaming package to internal, right? Which like when, you know, which didn't have meaning when, you know, package was created in Kubernetes. And then just have an ongoing effort, and it's a tax that we're going to have to pay to essentially create long-term interfaces around those things we can commit to, and then moving them out. That's a painful process. These things hopefully are going to be simpler than a lot of the client Go sort of API machinery stuff, where we're honestly, you know, that's still an ongoing process to be able to create the right interfaces around those. Hopefully we can find some stuff that we can break out sooner rather than later. But it's going to be ongoing work to take that stuff and actually create libraries out of it.
So here's a question, because we've talked about a couple ways, and I'm curious, which way do we think will be faster and less work and interesting enough that people will want to do?
We were able to refactor and move all of API machinery and API server into a staging repo in 3 months.
Okay, but here's the thing, David. I think technically that stuff is broken out, but practically, because every new version introduces breaking changes.
I didn't say that would be an end state. I said
right, yeah. I'm just what I'm just saying is that it seems like it's still an in process type of thing. I think the end state that you're right. I mean, you didn't say it was an end state.
So if you in 3 months you were able to eliminate all your bad links, if you were able to actually make yourself, so you built on top of the currently exposed repos, you would have your choice of what you wanted to do. If you're a leaf, you would have your choice of what you wanted to do. If nothing else in KSIO Kubernetes vendored you back in, sure, make yourself a separate repo and delete yourself from staging. That's a thing that could be done. We've done that in OpenShift as well. It worked.
How many people worked on that? How many people were involved in that effort? Like full time? Do you know?
Yes, 2 full time.
2 full time?
And that was 2 were the developers and the reviewers. We got vision sign off for every questionable choice from Daniel, but the vast majority of day-to-day, that was me and Stefan.
So why, I guess, like, do we need every single piece of this? Or like, I mean, some of these libraries should be simple, and I just wonder why, like, a glorified file path walk is, we're discussing this much about how to get it moved.
Well, I think that there's a whole bunch of other stuff that is, in my mind, there's a question of like, which of this stuff, like what is the granularity of libraries that we want to create out of this? Because you look at some of the stuff that gets bundled into client Go, and I actually think that that should probably be broken out as independent utility also. Like some of the stuff around like rate limiting queue really is a more fundamental thing that doesn't necessarily need to be part of client Go and could be useful not just to Kubernetes, but to a bunch of other stuff. People could take dependencies on that in a way where they can be sure that it's not going to change. So I definitely think that there's some stuff that's ready to be finished off and broken out. You know, the idiomatic Go is to create, you know, not necessarily JavaScript size packages, but smaller packages than we've tended to do so far.
Yeah, I guess that's one thing. Yeah, sorry if my thoughts are all over the place here, but there's one thing with the API machinery where, while it was successfully moved out in the sense that it could be vendored externally, the API interfaces the interfaces themselves are not in a place where they're easily consumable. Like we don't have a bunch of aggregated API servers, right? I don't think we have a single aggregated API server that wasn't built by a core Kubernetes hacker. And so that same strategy, like when API machinery was moved out, we said like that is meant only for people who are core Kubernetes contributors, right?
Yes, that's a statement not on the mechanism used to do it, but on what was moved and how stable or lack of stability we knew it was and would be, right? When we looked at something like API machinery, it lives in service to the API. We knew there were holes in it already. We knew that there were going to be significant changes to core functional pieces of how you handle decoding and codecs and copies and conversions, and we knew there were going to be changes, so we didn't put the effort in to trying to stabilize it because we knew we were going to change it. If instead you have something where you want to create a different unit, where you know you want your unit, you need to separate it from where it is today, and then you want to make an easy path API for using it. That is certainly achievable. You have roughly what you want today, at least in some cases. You have roughly what you want today. You keep using Resource Builder as an example. I don't know whether I would call that a good thing or a bad thing overall. Clayton and I fought over it many times. But it exists where it is today. You know there are other pieces you're going to move with it. As you look at your dependency tree, you are likely to find more, right? You have Resource Builder, you have handle kubeconfig files, where you may choose to strip out debt. You're going to have pieces for how you walk discovery. Lots of people are going to need that for walking discovery. You're going to have pieces around how you handle and parse the open API information, right? I see that as a pretty core piece of functionality for something like kube control. And I know there's at least 2 packages for handling it today in kube control. Your library is going to be fairly significant, and a move initially to staging does not preclude you eventually moving out, but it gives you time to figure out exactly what it is you want to do with kube control as a whole before you end up committing yourself to trying to manage vendor dependencies on things that are fairly fast moving, right? Like today, a resource builder without client Go might be possible, but I don't know that I would try it. A resource builder without API machinery is intractable. So,
I mean, it kind of depends on what we want to do moving forward. I'm not convinced we built the tools we would want to use today, right? Like you said, resource builder without client Go doesn't make sense, or without API machinery doesn't make sense. But like, I think what we want to use Resource Builder for Conflate for is just to walk the directory structure and parse the config files into like unstructured objects, right? So why do we need all this complexity?
I don't know. I suspect that you still want to have something that was able to manage shortcuts for you, and something that was able to handle category expansion, and a thing that was able to create field selectors and label selectors on your queries. I think you're still going to want those things. And
sometimes.
Well, I mean, if you want it sometimes, it's I won't say impossible to add on, but having it's a fairly common use case if you look at commands that try to select objects.
So can I back up here? Is part of the problem, and I know this has been part of the problem working on some of the other projects, is that things like Client Go require you to use API and API machinery. They end up being coupled because of the way things leak. The APIs are constantly changing. And so the packages that we have are moving fast and breaking things, which makes it really hard for things that use it. If the tools had maybe a more stable API and more stability about them, would it make the process of using them easier so we wouldn't be interested in alternatives?
That hasn't been my biggest concern.
Okay.
I mean, it is a problem. I agree with it. But I think my biggest concern is the entry-level complexity to use any of our libraries. So I guess if you look at setting up Resource Builder, it's like six things you need to set, even if you just want to like walk a file directory, as far as I can tell. And maybe I don't even understand it correctly. I'd like to see the libraries move more towards there's a sane default. Here's what you get if you just want the most basic behavior, and then additional layers of complexity are optional.
I understand. That makes sense. It's really hard to use our stuff, and having it be easier to use and to learn and to consume.
Yeah, like progressive discovery of features and complexity.
Well, and I also think because the interface has changed so much, nobody's built easier things on top of it because it's just shifting sands, and the documentation is essentially non-existent because it's almost immediately wrong at the next version. Right?
I don't think we even have documentation on something like a resource builder.
Right. Well, and the reason, like, I think some of that is just because the interface is unstable enough to actually make it make sense yet. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you, David. And I've gone with Jordan and him and I trying to review a PR, and neither one of us can make sense of the documentation that does exist. And I think the problem there is just that, like, it was written well at the time it was written. The folks, like, it has to do with the growth of the project, right? Because the people who wrote it at the time they wrote it had a much greater understanding of all the
you give Clayton too much credit for initially creating it. It was okay when it was initially created. I don't know if I was the initial reviewer on it or not, or just the initial victim. It is not a trivial thing to understand. As you try to add pieces to it, you're right in the sense that its structs don't make it easy to add. Progressive discovery just isn't a thing that it handles well. One thing it does do well that I do like is that if you construct it from one of the news or whatever it is, you never get to a point where you call a function and it just panics, right? Or it fails because you didn't set a REST mapper, or you didn't set a category expander, or you didn't set a decoder. Like, as long as you actually call it and set your pieces, whatever you call down the path will work.
Do you guys? Sorry, we just have 15 minutes left, and I know that I suspect, David, you're here for the second thing on the agenda. How do you guys feel about cutting the discussion?
I am here for that, partially, although I will say I know that like Clayton had comment before, I think on Menji's doc. Is it Menji? Sorry, I haven't pronounced it out loud before.
Mengqi.
Mengqi?
Yes.
Good job.
His doc, Clayton had a comment requesting to talk about it next year because he was on vacation. I guess we can't hold everything, but this is actually a pretty significant idea. The idea that we would basically abandon the current kube control, create a new tool, is significant. I'm not going to say
the second proposal or the first one now.
I guess I see the proposal that I just saw today. Sorry, I saw it had been open for.
Okay, we're talking about the second agenda item, right?
Yeah, I just saw it, but a lot of people have been out. I don't think it has been well reviewed or seen, and I probably missed a lot of the initial copies in it, but I didn't see a very active set of comments from the people I would expect to be commenting in this area.
Yeah, we should. I mean, everyone's out, so it'll probably.
Yeah, I don't mind talking about it. I guess what I'm saying is that I'm hoping that this meeting isn't going to try to say, yes, let's go forward and execute on this right away.
So what I'm going to say is that if we do go with that plan, I'm gonna call an audible and say, hey, this is something that is probably like a KEP level SIG architecture, communicated super widely, get a lot of feedback type of thing.
Okay.
That's my take on it. I don't want to like create problems for you, but I think there's going to be so many people invested in this that it's going to pay to make sure that that nobody gets surprised.
Yeah. I mean, to get the repo would require going through SIG architecture, if I understand.
So I do have mechanical things about, like, if we were going to do all this, I do have mechanical concerns about how it could actually work, and I'd be happy to talk about those.
Sure. Do you mind if I give a quick summary of quickly what it is, and then maybe the reasons for a couple of the decisions?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually start with how we pronounce it, because that's the real question in our heads, right?
That's the success factor here, right? Okay. I don't know. Actually, cuddle. I don't know. Or control. I I don't know. KTL. The proposal is effectively that in order to get to faster release cycles and be building outside of the main repo and unburden ourselves from a lot of the technical debt and decisions we've made, to just start building in the new repo today, new commands, kube control commands, using on top of client Go and API machinery and these sorts of things. And in order to avoid doing ground up rewrite, because doing ground up rewrite is just going to like really slow us down and kill us. We need to keep the existing functionality while we build out new functionality in a totally different environment. And so the proposal here is to effectively say we can build new commands in the new kube control repo, and we can keep all the existing commands in Kubernetes and vendor those into a single binary. And that way, we can effectively just keep everything we have today and then additively add on to it new commands built in a new repo. And that way, from day one, those new commands we can approach with a push on green approach, right? And set up bi-weekly releases and this sort of stuff, and actually get some of the benefits of a green field development while not having to start over from scratch. And the specific proposal there suggests that we effectively vendor all of Kubernetes into another binary and take the Cobra command, that is the kube control Cobra command, and just attach it to a new root. And with the specifics of vendoring there being, we don't vendor it at the root. We don't do the flattened dependencies. We basically do like a git submodule equivalent, where we just suck down the whole repo, pull out the Cobra command, and then attach it to a new Cobra command.
So, okay, were you done? I think you were done.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll say that I have fairly significant experience doing this. I have tried building multiple libraries that make use of client Go without stripping vendors, right? And it seems on the surface like it should be a very easy thing to do, right? We have Golang will allow you to say this is my interface, and I go in with the interface and I can make use of it. From a practical perspective, that has actually worked 0 times for me. A sum total of 0 times. What happens, the first thing is that Golang doesn't recognize a second order interface relationship. So if I have, and we use those everywhere. So if you have an interface that has a function that returns a different interface, when you try to create a compatible, it's not recognized as compatible. You cannot pass it. So in Cube, the canonical example is like a codec. A codec has a function for a decoder that returns a decoder. Well, you can't do that because it no longer conforms to codec because the decoder is different.
Hey, dude, we don't plan on doing any of that sort of stuff.
So I'm starting here because the next thing that happens to you, once you resolve those, once you start handling that, is that the libraries that you depend upon will be hitting globals that exist inside of the Golang core libraries. And the simplest example is glog. Everyone uses glog. You accidentally vendor it twice in 2 different non-strip vendor trees, your process panics as soon as you start it. Because you have 2 copies of glog, they're both hitting the same flag, it double registers. There are other library examples that do the same thing with, there's like a default global HTTP server. I didn't even know it was a thing, but it'll panic when 2 unrelated when 2 of the same library that you vendor twice both try to set a handler. And it'll drive you bonkers. So the straight git submodule like you can't do that because you can't actually make it build, so it's not a Git submodule anymore, right? Like when you build it, it doesn't work. So you start.
What do you mean when you build it, it doesn't work?
Well, the Git submodule includes the entire vendor tree, right? Like that's the point of the submodule. It is the entire tree built in, and now you have something that you can't remove because it's part of the Git submodule that you want to keep in sync, and so you're stuck, right? So that's very problematic. The next thing, the next in your proposal was that you would actually start vendoring other commands from other sources. And so even if you manage to get all the core kube control-y stuff building somehow with enough of the vendor tree stripped out that you actually manage to make it compile and that you maintain it again somehow, when you try to start relying on, say, a command that requires client go, and you have two commands that you want to vendor that require client go, and you want to provide something that lets you parse a kube config file. We'll see you have those three things. So you have two different commands, both that use client go, and some sort of core functionality that you provide that says the kube control parsing, some sort of infrastructure you provide. If you have to agree on levels, you're never able to vendor again. Because what happens is one piece will move up, your other pieces won't. Your core infrastructure that you have built will require a level that doesn't match, so the utility that you're trying to pass through doesn't function. You could try to dodge it by saying that you are only going to share a single dependency, and that single dependency is going to be Cobra or Viper. I don't remember. I think you mentioned both. But so say you depend on Cobra, and you try to resolve it in that way. So you have one shared level of Cobra. I'll point out that not all levels of Cobra behave the same. And in fact, we're bumping levels of Cobra because we want new Cobra behavior. But let's assume that you manage to get everything to compile. Because of the different behaviors in Cobra at runtime, you're not guaranteed that the things you vendored will still work. If you tried to pass anything through, you would be trying to move everyone to the same level of client go at the same time.
Well, we could, with the Cobra thing, if that's the only shared dependency, we could just pick a version of Cobra, like pin it to the same version.
I guess what I'm trying to do as an example here is that the rabbit hole just goes deeper, and you end up in a place where you can't use any known vendoring tool today, right? Because if you try to do something that vendors, you get two choices. You either strip vendor or you don't strip vendor. There's no strip out the pieces that conflict, right? There's no option for that. You would be trying to build your own vendoring tool on top to manage it. And don't get me wrong, I would love to have that vendoring tool because I need it in OpenShift, but we haven't found it and we haven't written it. So,
I mean, how many? So I know about glog. So as I did a proof of concept, and I didn't exhaustively test all the options, but I tried vendoring Kubernetes into another command, and then I just removed glog, and it seemed to work. Glog and I guess Cobra. Like, how many? We're talking like there's 3 things you encountered that were problematic with the flags registering thing.
No, I got to 4 or 5. I mean, flags registering was one. I had a prototype for a client Go that punched out maybe 6 projects to be able to make it work, and that was just the first level client Go. It wasn't something I tried to vendor the thing that I vendored. The thing that I would step back and say is if you're starting from scratch, it's tempting to say, let me get a bunch of stuff for free from the existing kube control, but do you actually need those things for free? Or would we not be better off actually starting from the perspective of, I have a new tool, this is what I want to build, and build it up with each piece from scratch? You would probably build something first, and I could see that leveraging something like a resource builder. But if you don't actually care for the existing resource builder API, and I could see maybe reasons why you wouldn't like it, although I think the vast majority of people will want it. Why whiteboard, and if people want the old kube control behavior, they can use it. If you build a plugin, once you build a plugin infrastructure, make kube control compliant with that plugin infrastructure and just dynamically include it. That seems like a very achievable thing that completely divorces you from the need to pull in a huge vendor tree and keep yourself up to date. And staying up to date is brutal. Again, we have experience downstream in OpenShift, and it sounds like Matt also has had negative experiences staying up to date. I have severe reservations about the tractability of trying to vendor in this code base.
And I'll add here the dependency management issue of trying to just deal with things that don't work rather than vendor, strip downstream vendors or not is really, really, really a hard problem. I know I wrote Glide, right? We've actually looked into this and discussed it. I've discussed this at length and whiteboarded for quite a while with Sam Boyer, who's done DEP, on how do we deal with this. It's a very hard problem. The people here working full-time for a year will struggle to come up with the dependency manager. So we shouldn't even think about trying to go outside of what you can do today because it's such a hard problem. But yeah, this is a difficult space.
Okay, I mean just if we have a nice plugin installation infrastructure and auto update and have the right infrastructure, having the kube control binary like installable, and maybe when you start the tool, it just prompts, do you want to download the kube control plugin, right? Then maybe that solves the problem. You think that would be simpler?
I think that would make me feel a lot better about the plan in general. Like as I was saying, I was looking at this and I don't know that I could actually manage it. And yeah, vendoring is hard. Also, did I hear that Matt Farina is the guy I need to complain to about Glide problems?
Unfortunately, yes.
Awesome.
Come talk to me.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I mean some of the things you said I definitely have observed, so that makes sense. I don't know. I think like if we can just iterate quickly and see what works and what doesn't before we go GA with it, then I'm happy. So if we want to start with trying it as a plugin and just hooking in some things so that it automatically downloads it or prompts you to download it, then that seems fine to me.
Yeah. If you wouldn't mind making updates that at least mention and describe that so that when people like Jordan or Clayton, who I know will probably come in and have an opinion, or is Andy on vacation yet, Joe? I would have expected Andy in here too, or you, or someone.
I mean, like Andy. Yeah, I don't think Andy's. I think he's still around. But you mean in this meeting here about refactoring stuff, or
the C or KTL? I don't know how to pronounce the thing.
Yeah,
man in particular.
Right,
I don't think he's caught on to that yet. It's going to be interesting. But he wants to tilt at that logging windmill first, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. We can get Mache in here and pronounce a word with no vowels. Or I guess I don't actually know Brian. Is Brian the Heptio CLI guy?
Yes, he is.
Okay. But just so that it can be more current with the description, I think a lot of people will have been bitten by vendoring, particularly Kubernetes related pieces in the past, and they will have opinions.
Okay, I'll update that. I'm out, so I probably won't update it immediately after this, but I'll get to it soon.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm on vacation the rest of the year.
So yeah, that was that background's helpful. It sounds like we generally there are no vocal opponents of the notion of we should be able to start building new infrastructure in a new place, release it quickly, and at the same time be able to pull in the functionality of kube control so that people don't have to manage a bunch of binaries simultaneously.
I was intentionally trying to avoid talking about those particular merits because I think that's a great discussion for the next year for a wider set of people when more people have seen this. Like when I came in, there were comments from two people, and it's comment worthy for more than two people. So I'm sure it just needs to be more widely distributed. And that's a discussion. Do we want to do it? I think Joe mentioned SIG architecture. That might be a good place to talk about it at some point as well. It's a big choice.
Yeah, it is a big choice. I mean, it's definitely a big change. I think it's necessary, like we've been talking about moving out or trying to move out for a year now.
I guess I would say that progress was made in that past year, right? Like you look at just the last 3 months, right? We now have external versions being used in our set commands. We now have a generic scale client. So we're looking at seeing the scale command go polymorphic this release. We have now an example in API machinery of how to actually manage a generic scale client that can speak to multiple API versions on the other side. So something like a generic log client is certainly a possibility to follow. A generic log client or a generic rollout client or exec client, all those things now we have patterns for, and the second ones always go faster. So I look at it and I say it doesn't look like much progress got made, but if you look at just the last 3 months, a significant amount of progress and a significant number of patterns have exposed themselves. And so I wouldn't give up.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that progress, and I'm happy to see it. There's things like the conversion thing, which I don't think we have a good solution for how that's going to get moved out. I worry about the level of test coverage we have on our tools. Like a lot of stuff has been developed with a 3-month release cycle with the assumption people are going to find broken stuff as they're playing around with it during development. I don't think anyone's confident that our tests really make sure that we can push stuff out purely off those.
Right. I mean, other things I would point to in the last 6 months are patterns for flags to options and how you can actually have a standard and run them through conversion and still have the flexibility you need. We figured that out in the last 6 months in the API server, right? Even in the last 3 months, we improved it. So, even in categories like that.
Something to think about, though, is the timing. I mean, we talked about last year making progress, but now the ecosystem is really starting to get a lot stronger, and they want these common libraries and tools. And part of me wonders, is it better to try to move them out and make them more consumable, separate than from trying to refactor, to make them more easily consumable downstream? Because people are already starting to try and write their own functionality to replicate the parts they need, because we're taking a long time. And now that we've got a much more stable foundation for Kubernetes, as folks have been saying, the people are going to build and operate apps on top of Kubernetes. The people who need to interact with the API is much bigger than those of us who've normally been around. And they're going to go create a lot of their own tools, because a lot of them just do that naturally, and because there are gaps there. And they need these common tools. And the way we consume them today isn't very easy. What time frame is it going to be to make them easier? And is there another approach to getting there more quickly that also benefits the CLI?
I think that something like a time frame is dependent on how we get there, and I think that would be a great conversation for next year.
Yeah.
And it looks like there is something else. Well, we're over time anyway. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that for the beginning of next year, let's not forget to have this broader conversation about, setting some bullet points as our major goals for the year, for the SIG specifically. We did that at the beginning of last year when we were much less people in the group. So I think that's a great discussion to talk about that in a broader manner at the beginning of next year, right after the holidays. So let's not forget to do that, and it's usually a great exercise.
Thanks, Fabiano, for that reminder. That's a great idea.
Yeah, I was about to propose that we should send out the proposal for the new kubectl thing to kubedev, because that seems like something that every single kube developer and users will actually be affected by in one way or the other. So that's something that should be broadly discussed, not just with the at the SIG architecture level, but the entire community level, actually.
That's a good idea. I mean, I don't think it's at the maturity level yet where I'd like to do that.
Okay.
Maybe in January, like incorporating David's feedback, right? Maybe, and I'd like to see what Jordan and Clayton say and that sort of stuff. But yes, that makes sense to do once I think we have consensus within this group. Or at least,
that sounds fair.
Or at least there aren't a lot of things that we haven't really, don't have an answer for yet.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, well, Fabiano, enjoy your leave. You will be missed. I will think about you every other week. Go.
All right. Thanks, Philip, and thanks, everyone. And have a great year, great holidays for all of you guys. And, I can still be reached on my personal email. So if you really need anything, I'm not sure I'll be able to check my emails every day with the upcoming adventure. But anyways, for sure, just feel free to ping me if you really need anything. And it was great working with you guys, and really have some great holidays and a great year.
All right, later.
Okay, see you guys.
Enjoy your year.